This video is for chapter 10 from your textbook. That chapter is on sexualities. One thing that kind of sets these lecture slides and video apart from previous lecture slides and videos is, although I do go over the bulk of the material from the chapter, I don't necessarily do it in the order that it's presented. And that's because a lot of this material is kind of co-opted from Lisa Wade, who's one of your textbook authors, is from her book, American Hookup, which is a book that I've taught in my class when I've taught 3408 in the past. And so for that reason, I don't necessarily think the structure of this chapter, makes the most sense. She doesn't necessarily provide a lot of context for some of these concepts, and the order can be a little funky. So for that reason, just know that, the video aligns with the lecture notes, but the lecture notes are not, perfectly, ordered, reflecting the order of how the ideas are presented in the chapter. And of course, there, like always, there's additional information going beyond the scope of the textbook. So just kind of be aware of that as you are reading and studying. So we began our discussion around sexual identity and sexual orientation in chapter 5 when we were talking about intersectionality and the matrix of domination and accompanying gender strategies for our different social identities. So this is just a reminder of those kind of primary terms. Once again, just kind of emphasizing that although we tend to use the very popular threefold categorization of homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual, sexual orientation, like gender, is really more of a continuum. There has also been kind of the emerging category of asexual as a sexual identity, pushing back against the medicalization of lack of sexual attraction, that it's not a medical or psychological disorder, it's just a different form of sexual identity. Once again, just a reminder, hopefully at this point of the semester, you are all, if you came into this course with this bad habit, hopefully you've broken yourself of it. But, gender and sex identity is not the same thing as sexual orientation. So you can't necessarily tell someone's sexual orientation, based on their gender expression, right? How effeminate or how masculine they are. That's some real compulsory heterosexuality, hegemonic masculinity type of thinking. And hopefully we are all beyond that at this point. This is maybe a better representation. There are a lot of different representations of that continuum. But, we do know that sexual identity is a continuum that's been pretty clear since early research, Kinsey's 1940s research on human sexuality, that kind of showed that not as many people as you would think have had exclusively heterosexual or exclusively homosexual experiences in the course of their lifetime. And for that reason, it's sometimes very difficult to measure sexuality because people may engage in same-sex behavior, sexual behavior, but they don't necessarily identify as being homosexual or even bisexual, or even, to throw out, one of our newer terms, even like pansexual. They might very much identify as heterosexual, but have had, same-sex desires, or, even, same-sex sexual experiences. So that makes the whole question about what determines sexual orientation kind of tricky to add. There are people who spend a lot of time on studying this. And of course, there's a lot of research around, both cultural factors as well as biological factors. And here I am just kind of narrowing it down to one quick slide. But, just know that we do know that culturally, if, there's a diversity of sexual expression around the world. And we do know that cultures that are more tolerant and embrace a wider variety of sexual identities, unsurprisingly, they have more people in their population who adopt those identities because they are presented as being, legitimate identities and relationship, options. But then there are people that really focus on, like, the biological factors, and the idea, in the words of Lady Gaga, are people really born that way? Is sexual orientation largely fixed at birth? And so these types of studies, they focus on genes, hormones, epigenetic research. There's looking at kind of twin studies, between identical and fraternal twins that have been, adopted and raised in different families. All of that, trying to answer that question. We don't have a definitive answer. So that means for, like, a lot of sociological research, we just go by, the identity that people claim, even though we are aware that if we were to define sexual orientation in a different way, like based on, have you ever had a same-sex experience, or, what percentage of your experiences have been same-sex experiences, or, do you have same-sex desires? We know that that would probably yield us a much greater number than people who actually claim the identity. And there was a study that did show that, that showed that, the number of people who report any homosexual activity is far greater than the number of people who then go on to claim either a bisexual or a homosexual identity. And particularly, once again, we see that for at least female respondents. And there is some qualitative research that says that the gap between men and women there shouldn't be as big. But once again, we have some social desirability bias going on where, even when promised confidentiality, you just have, male respondents maybe less likely to be willing to report past homosexual activity if they don't claim a homosexual or bisexual identity. And so why would they be so reluctant to claim that, right? Well, it has a lot to do with how our society is structured and how we have typically, perceived and depicted and treated people who are homosexual. So once again, these are terms from chapter 5. So just a reminder, that to be masculine and feminine in most Anglo-European societies is to be heterosexual. And it's that concept of compulsory heterosexuality, that heterosexuality is the default or the obligatory sexuality. It's the status that provides, the institutional privileges. And going along with that is the idea of heteronormative, which speaks to how our society is structured. We live in a society where, we assume people, are going to, be interested in people of the opposite sex, right? We set up courts, prom court, homecoming court, around the idea of a king and queen, opposite sex, and they have a dance, right? When we see little children playing together, we make comments like, oh, that's your little boyfriend or your little girlfriend, right? Just assuming that is, how, these children who at this point, aren't necessarily even probably thinking about dating or sex, we're kind of putting that identity on them. And really, maybe the best example around heteronormativity and compulsory heterosexuality is the fact that, you don't have to come out as heterosexual because that's just what you're presumed to be. No one asks, when did you know you were straight? However, when did you know you were gay is a very common question. And that is a privilege, to not feel as if you have to explain your sexual desires. And so there is this questionnaire that was created to kind of make that point. It's called the heteronormative questionnaire. And I pulled a couple of sample questions to give you a sense of, how the types of questions that we ask people or think in our heads about people who are homosexual, how, it doesn't even almost sound right to substitute heterosexuality for homosexuality. And it doesn't sound right because, of course, we've just been raised to think of heterosexuality as being normative, while we've been raised to think of homosexuality as being deviant. And that the fact that we kind of think about it that way, and sometimes I have students like, well, it's always been that way, but that's where it actually gets really like funny from a historical standpoint, because heterosexuality and homosexuality are actually relatively recent concepts. 1902 and 1897. And they were invented by Victorian era sexologists. And, if you read some of those early theories, like a lot of pseudoscience, they sound super crazy because, it was based on a lot of assumptions and bias, and not necessarily, the type of scientific rigor and objectivity that we associate with science today. So these labels were created. They created categories for behavior. And, before that, it's not that people weren't engaging in homosexual acts, sexual acts with people of the same sex, but previously those acts did not define them as a person. It was an act that they engaged in. But after, the Victorian era and these concepts were created, instead it kind of became an identity, that people were labeled with. And in most cases, this was a marginalized, stigmatized identity, one that came with a good deal of prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination. And that pretty much was the case for a long period of time, until we start to reach the late 1960s, in the early 1970s, in the midst of all of our other kind of movements: the civil rights movement, the women's movement, Black Power movement, Brown Power movement, Red Power movement, so many movements. And so we have the gay rights movement, where this is the first time like that a unified message was kind of pushed, that the problem wasn't homosexuality. It was actually the discrimination and the stigma and the prejudice that gay people faced. And so, your book does discuss the significance of the Stonewall riot in 1969. And this is in New York. And it was just about kind of the police harassment that gay men, as well as transgender, women in particular, kind of faced from law enforcement, how they would be harassed, at their bars and their after hour spots, that they were always just kind of being rounded up and arrested for no good reason. And then finally, at some point they were just like, we had enough. They fought back, and it was just kind of an extended, kind of couple weeks of pushing back against this mistreatment. And coming together as a community to kind of say we deserve better than this. And one important consequence of that, as your book discussed, was the creation of the organization, the Gay Liberation Front. And so you want to think about this like any other civil rights organization. The focus was on, getting equal treatment for people who were homosexual in the community. And in the same way that the Black Power movement had Black is Beautiful, this is where that, if you've ever heard gay is good, that motto, it comes out of this time period. And there were some successes, right? Homosexuality was declassified as a mental disorder in 1973. Before that, it was right there in, the DSM for all of my psychology people. So, people would be diagnosed as having a mental disorder if they were homosexual. And they eliminated that in 1973. You have the emergence of gayborhoods in places, like San Francisco and New York and Chicago, where people that were part of the community were, able to form supportive communities where they could, go out with their partners to, restaurants and bars and clubs, and, rent homes and apartments, and have an increased amount of like safety and security and freedom than, what they had had. And then we also had our first openly gay politician elected in San Francisco in 1977. And this is also when, they introduced the term homophobia, right? They named, they named this discrimination and this prejudice that they were experiencing from people, and there's a lot of power in naming. Now, some of these kind of great strides in the 70s, there was unfortunately a setback, in the community of just a really sad, health crisis, and that was the AIDS epidemic. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, which causes AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is largely, but not always, sexually transmitted. You can kind of see, like, at least in term, and these numbers used to be a little different back in the 80s, before we were more aware of HIV AIDS. There was, an increased likelihood that you would get it from injection drug use, or, in those early years, even like blood transfusions and medical procedures. But now, especially, it's primarily sexually transmitted, and most new cases of AIDS result from men having sex with other men. But among the women who have it, the greatest source of new cases is sex with men. But admittedly, oftentimes those men that transmit the disease to them, a good number of those men actually got the disease from having sex with other men. So, that's kind of the current trend in cases in the United States currently. Our cases and deaths have decreased. This is nothing like, what it was when it was at its peak epidemic levels, in the early 80s. But it's also worth noting that a lot of those deaths could have possibly been prevented if the U.S. government was just not so slow to respond to the AIDS crisis. They did not give serious attention until the epidemic began to spread to the heterosexual population. And before that, it was largely seen to be a disease that was limited to the gay male population. And there was even kind of a derogatory term for it, called GRID, which is an acronym that stands for gay-related immune deficiency. And so since the 1980s, as more resources have been allotted to research and the medical treatment of the disease, there have been important advances. And so thus people who are diagnosed as HIV positive, and even people who get AIDS, can live with the disease longer and remain healthier. That being said, it's still the most lethal of all the STIs. So, kind of keeping in mind that, they had this successful kind of, run in the 70s of gaining rights, but then they had, the community had a very hard decade of the 80s, largely because of, the AIDS epidemic, and not just the sickness and the death that kind of rocked the LGBTQ community, but also just the increased kind of stigma that was then associated with being gay, because people were so afraid of the disease. So there was an increase in prejudice and discrimination. So when you think about it like that, it becomes less surprising that marriage just wasn't a prominent issue until, for most gays and lesbians, until the mid to late 1990s. And so you can kind of start to see when it became an issue that they began pressing for, when you look at the policies that were passed, that kind of pushed back against their activism. Because what we see during the 1990s is the fact that, the military had the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. And then the Defense of Marriage Act, which is frequently called DOMA, it also kind of brought recognition and public attention, because what DOMA did was it pretty much defined marriage. It was a congressional act that defined marriage as being between a man and a woman, and that was in 1996. And so, this is just a kind of timeline of the fight for marriage equality. From 1996 to 2009, although different things were happening at the state level, and you can see that, some states, began to legalize it, as early as 2004, but then some states also explicitly banned it. It wasn't until 2009 when President Obama declared that DOMA was unconstitutional and the Department of Justice would no longer defend it in court that we started to see kind of a swifter uptake. Because by saying that the Department of Justice was no longer going to defend it in court, it kind of set the issue on like a very fast-paced course to the Supreme Court. And that's largely what happened. Because in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down DOMA. They said it was unconstitutional. And so as we then set the stage for the 2015 Obergefell-Hodges decision that basically said states had to allow same-sex couples to marry and must recognize same-sex marriages from other states, you can kind of see that we had just an amalgamation of states doing different things. It was prohibited in 33 states. It was permitted in 17 states in the District of Columbia. And, so it obviously had the makings of just being a very kind of contentious issue because, and that is exactly what happened because people move around, right? A lot of us don't stay in one state, one state our entire life. So the idea that moving, for a job or, moving back home to take care of family would put your whole marriage, place your whole marriage into this kind of unrecognized, status, that honestly just wasn't going to be a stable position that the country could hold for long. So in 2015, the Obergefell-Hodges decision pretty much made same-sex legal everywhere. And it's worth noting because sometimes people are like, why can't we wait? Why couldn't it have been put to a vote? Well, as you can kind of see, this is from 2013, so it's a couple years early. But although, the number of people who favored allowing gays to marry versus the number of people who were opposed, the favor was outpacing the opposed. It still wasn't that far from really 50-50. And, certainly if just by the basis of their sexual minority status, if we waited for the majority to agree to give rights to minorities, well, let's just say that a lot of minorities, not just sexual minorities, a lot of minorities would perhaps not enjoy the rights that they do. And, and so that's part of the significance of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court decision. And so, you can kind of see that this question asking, basically saying it's always wrong or almost always wrong, you can see that there was this steady decline. But we certainly had not eradicated homophobia. We had not eradicated heterosexism, at the time that we granted marriage equality. And I would imagine that there is still a sizable minority of people who would still say that they have that belief if that question was to be asked today. So moving kind of away from sexual orientation to kind of some other aspects of sexuality, particularly sexual acts or sexual scripts, let's consider, some of the points from your book. That, because heterosexuality is seen as a given, homosexuality has long been viewed as needing to be explained. And it's oftentimes been seen as a form of deviance. And you can even see it by how, we think about sex or, what we count as being real sex. And your book discusses that through the concept of coital imperative, right? That we often think about sex as being defined as this, the penetration, penile penetration of the female, of the female body, usually the vagina. And so even our kind of definition of sex, what we think about as counting as sex is reflects this compulsory heterosexuality. And then, of course, when we think about kind of, sexual behaviors and sexual relationships, our dominant relationship model is associated with heterosexuality is monogamy. And your book talks about this in terms of mononormativity, that we have just kind of normalized the idea that that you have one sexual partner, that that you have one romantic partner. And mononormativity, I think what's interesting in America, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the family chapter, is, we used to think about monogamy as like you have one partner, as the vows state until, the day you die, until death do us part. But of course, in a country that has a pretty high divorce rate, and has had a pretty high divorce rate for, really the last 50 years now, almost. Now, of course, we're more of a serial monogamy country, right? We have one partner at a time, but we could have multiple spouses during our lifetime. And so that means that when your book discusses things like polyamory and open relationships, those things those forms of relationships have become increasingly popular forms of consensual non-monogamy, but they are still, largely, seen as being deviant, as seen as being, not, part of that mononormative model. Going beyond those concepts, what other types of sexual conduct between heterosexual partners has been considered deviant? Traditionally, there's been four types: premarital sex, which is your sex before marriage; extramarital sex, which is a fancy way of saying adultery or cheating. So it's you're married and you're having sex with someone who is not your spouse. Promiscuous sex, which of course is very subjective, right? But it's the idea that you're having sex with too many partners, sex with too many people. And then finally, underage sex, once again, a kind of subjective element there, right? Because, what is underage, right? We have the age of consent in most states, but oftentimes that age of consent really only becomes important when you're thinking about, when one partner is older, or significantly older, a little older, doesn't matter, but they're older than the age of consent. But like, what about if, you have two underage people, how young is too young to have sex? And so, if you think about people's attitudes, like, how do we know that some of this is still deviant? Let's look at this slide right here. The percentage of people who say that this behavior is morally wrong. Married men and women having an affair. 91% of people in this sample, and it was meant to be a representative sample of American adults, they feel that this is wrong. 63% say sex between teenagers is wrong. 38% say gay or lesbian relations are wrong. 33% say premarital sex is wrong. And then, of course, there's also some questions about, having a child out of wedlock and divorce. So, there certainly seems to be that there are a sizable number of people in this country that still feel like there are some behaviors that are unacceptable, that are deviant in regards to sex. And I'm going to delve a little deeper into a few of those. So first of all, teen sex is a behavior that oftentimes, especially among adults, they can approach it from this very panicky standpoint because they often see it as being widespread and probably increasing. However, pretty much all the data that we have has suggested that adolescents having sex has actually fallen in past decades. We've used multiple data sources, and it's suggested that, teens are having less sex than previous generations of teens. So at this point, some of the adults that are freaking out about the ideas of teens having sex, they probably had a much greater likelihood of having teen sex themselves, or, having friends who did, than even the current teenagers. And among the teens who are having sex, it's worth noting that condom usage has increased, and teen birth rates have actually, gone down, because oftentimes that is the primary concern with regard to teenage sex, is the idea that teenage sex is going to result in unmarried teenage pregnancy. That is a much greater fear than disease, especially now that, people kind of perceive the AIDS, HIV epidemic as being under control, and pretty much all other STIs being, just a 7 to 10 day course of medicine. But there's this sense that, teenage sex that results in teenage pregnancy, will result in teenagers having their lives off track, not following, the success sequence of, graduating high school, going to college, graduating college, getting a job, establishing your career, getting married, being financially stable, maybe even owning a home, and then having children, right? That teenage sex kind of throws a wrench into all that. And, that attitude isn't totally without merit, as, certainly one of the predictors for poverty is related to out of marriage teenage wedlock. But as noted, teenage pregnancy rates in America have declined. At one point, it was declared a national crisis by President Clinton in 1995. And we'll talk about, what the response to that has been. But it has steadily declined since then. Although it's worth noting that, even though it's declined, we're still higher than other industrialized nations. Probably has a lot to do with, for a long time, it has a lot to do with healthcare access, and it has a lot to do with, reproductive, people's, kind of reproductive contraceptives, access to contraceptives, particularly contraceptives that have a lower failure rate, like hormonal birth control, IUDs, implants, especially among young populations. The United States, when compared to other countries, we do make it a lot harder and more expensive for teenagers to access that type of healthcare. Particularly in areas of the country where they don't have, health clinics, accessible health clinics.